After spending 3 years teaching English in a small rural town in Japan, I returned to Oregon with a sense of fulfillment and a deep craving for home. Living abroad had been incredible, the food, the culture, the people, but there was something about the quiet familiarity of my hometown that had been calling to me for months. During my last year in Japan, I'd scraped together enough savings and finally pulled the trigger on something I'd been dreaming about since my early 20s, buying my own home. It wasn't just a starter house or an investment, it was the house. A charming, 2-story property with a wraparound porch, a backyard with an old oak tree, and a view of the Willamette River that I couldn't believe I could actually afford. It cost me $620,000, every cent of which came from my own hard work. No cosigners, no shared ownership, just mine. I'd signed all the paperwork digitally while still living overseas, working closely with a realtor I'd known since high school. The home had been sitting vacant when I purchased it, and I'd arranged for basic upkeep while I was finishing my teaching contract. I imagined stepping inside it for the first time with my suitcase in hand and finally breathing easy. But when I pulled into the driveway after the 13-hour flight, utterly jet-lagged but buzzing with excitement, something felt off before I even stepped out of the rental car. There was a navy blue SUV parked in my driveway, not a model I recognized, and certainly not something I had authorized anyone to use. At first, I assumed maybe it belonged to a neighbor or someone hired to handle landscaping. The lawn looked freshly mowed, and the porch had a few new potted plants I didn't remember from the listing photos. Still, I didn't think too much of it, not until I walked up the steps, suitcase rolling behind me, and rang the bell. The door opened almost immediately, and a man I had never seen in my life stared back at me. He looked to be in his late 30s, maybe early 40s. Tall, stocky, unshaven. He wore jeans, a faded Oregon Ducks t-shirt, and had a dish towel slung over his shoulder like he'd just come from the kitchen. The way he looked at me, surprised, but not scared, made my stomach drop. It wasn't the look someone gives a stranger on their porch. It was more like the look you give someone who's just shown up at your house unannounced. For a long second, neither of us said anything. I managed to stammer out, "Hi, can I help you?" His eyes narrowed just slightly. This is my house," he replied. "Can I help you?" I blinked. Laughed awkwardly, assuming there had to be some mistake. "I think there's a misunderstanding. I own this house. I just got back from Japan, I bought it 3 years ago." The man didn't move. "No, I've been living here for over 2 years. I bought it at auction." That word, auction, hit me like a punch in the chest. I felt my heart start to pound as I reached for my phone, opening the email folder where I kept all the documentation, the deed, the mortgage statements, the inspection reports. I pulled up the county tax site and typed in the address. And that's when I saw it. The property was no longer in my name. According to the records, it had been repossessed by the bank for non-payment 18 months earlier. It had been sold at auction shortly after. I stood on the porch in stunned silence, trying to piece together how this could have happened. I had never received any notice of foreclosure, no letters, no calls, no emails. While in Japan, I had set up automatic mortgage payments through my US bank account. Every month, without fail, the payment went through. I even had digital statements to prove it. There was no reason, none, that the house should have been repossessed. And yet, the county records didn't lie. Legally, this man wasn't trespassing. I was. "I'm calling the police," he said, his tone no longer friendly. "You need to leave." My legs felt like jelly. I backed off the porch, murmuring apologies even though my head was spinning with disbelief. I got back into the car, closed the door, and just sat there gripping the steering wheel, staring at the house I had dreamed about for years. The house I had furnished in my mind 100 times. The house that had, apparently, never truly been mine. After a few minutes, I drove to the nearest gas station and parked in a corner spot, trying to collect myself. I called my realtor, but she didn't pick up. I called the bank, and after being transferred 4 times, I finally got someone from the mortgage department. I explained everything, the payments, the purchase, the current occupant. The representative was polite but clearly confused. After some digging, she told me that the mortgage account had been closed over a year ago. "Closed for non-payment," she repeated, almost like she didn't believe it either. I asked her to send me all available documentation, including notices sent. She agreed, but said that because so much time had passed, some of the records might be archived or purged. That night, I checked into a cheap motel off the highway. I didn't sleep. I just stared at the ceiling, replaying every step of the last 3 years in my head. I'd done everything right. I'd followed the rules, paid on time, used professionals. And yet someone had stolen my house, legally, and I had no idea how. I stood there on the porch, gripping the strap of my duffel bag so tightly my knuckles had gone white, my body still aching from the flight and the hours I'd spent in a rental car that smelled like stale coffee and old fast food. The man in front of me didn't budge. He didn't look angry, just confused, like he was trying to decide if I was some door-to-door salesman or a particularly bold scammer. His eyes scanned me, lingering on my travel-wrinkled clothes and the suitcase behind me, before landing back on my face. I repeated myself, slower this time, hoping the calmness in my voice would diffuse the rising tension between us. I told him this was my house. He blinked, almost like he hadn't heard me the first time, then tilted his head slightly and said, "I bought it last week." I didn't react at first. Not really. I thought maybe he was mistaken, or that we were somehow talking about two different houses, like maybe there was another property on the same street with a similar number. But I looked up at the porch, then at the structure itself. It was unmistakably my house. Or, at least, it had been. But even as I stood there, I began to notice details that hadn't registered before. The front door, it was new. A different style than I remembered from the listing photos. The mailbox was sleek, modern, stainless steel, instead of the old black metal one I'd seen in pictures. The numbers mounted near the door were different too, larger, bolder, shinier. These weren't just cosmetic changes. They were intentional. Someone had made sure to erase traces of what the house used to be. I took a step back and looked at the driveway again. The landscaping was different too. Fresh gravel had been laid, some bushes near the walkway had been trimmed, and there were solar-powered lights lining the path that hadn't been there when I'd purchased the property. It wasn't like someone had just moved in. It was like they had taken over. My heart started to hammer in my chest as I tried to steady my breathing, unsure if I was about to faint or throw up. I didn't say anything else to the man. I just turned around, walked down the steps as calmly as I could, and got back into the rental car. My hand shook as I pulled out my phone and dialed Ryan. He was my older brother by 4 years and the only family member I had who still lived in Oregon full-time. He'd been the one I trusted to check in on the house from time to time while I was overseas, even though he'd never been overly enthusiastic about it. I figured it was a formality, a backup plan, just in case something came up. I didn't expect him to do much. Just be a set of eyes if anything weird happened. When he answered, his tone was flat, like I had just interrupted him during a football game or while he was scrolling his phone. I didn't even give him a chance to say hello. I jumped straight in, panic rising in my voice as I told him someone was living in my house, a stranger, and they said they had just bought it. I was pacing outside the car by then, my voice tight, my breath short. There was a long pause on the other end of the line. No shock, no confusion. And then, as casually as if he were reading off a grocery list, Ryan said, "Yeah. I sold it." The silence that followed wasn't from the line cutting out or a dropped call. It was my brain short-circuiting, trying to process what I had just heard. I asked him to repeat himself, unsure if I'd misunderstood or if this was some kind of cruel joke. But his voice didn't change. "I sold it," he said again. "A couple weeks ago. It was sitting empty for years. I figured you weren't coming back." I think that's the moment I stopped breathing. I was gripping the phone so tightly my hand had gone numb, and I could hear a ringing in my ears that had nothing to do with the connection. I asked him what the hell he was talking about, how he could possibly sell a house that didn't belong to him. I reminded him that I bought the house myself, paid for it entirely, had the deed in my name, had documentation. He sighed, like I was being dramatic. "You were gone," he said. "You didn't even come back when Dad died. You didn't return my messages. The place was collecting dust. It didn't make sense for it to sit there while you were playing teacher overseas." I could barely believe what I was hearing. First of all, I had returned his messages, maybe not every single one, but I wasn't unreachable. And I had sent him updates, asked him to let me know if there were any issues with the house. He never said anything about problems, or about any mail piling up, or notices from the bank. As far as I knew, everything was running smoothly. I asked him how he even managed to sell it. Did he forge papers? Did he break in? Did he convince someone at the bank he was the owner? Ryan didn't answer right away. When he did, his voice was colder than I expected. I talked to a guy. He handled everything. Cash deal, off the books. Honestly, it was easy. You should have taken care of it yourself if you wanted it so bad. I was shaking, not from the cold, but from the sheer rage that was boiling in my chest. I asked him how much he sold it for. He told me, without hesitation, $285,000. I couldn't believe it. He'd practically given it away, a house worth over $600,000, sold for less than half that amount, all because he decided it was his to deal with. And the worst part was that he didn't even sound guilty. Not once during that entire phone call did he apologize. Not once did he say he regretted it. To him, it was a logical decision. A practical one. He had always been like that, indifferent, emotionally detached, the kind of person who thought feelings were optional. I told him I was going to the police. He didn't say anything for a few seconds, and then he said, "Do what you gotta do." Then he hung up. I stood there in that driveway, in front of the house that used to be mine, and felt like my entire world had shifted sideways. This wasn't just about a property. It was about trust. About betrayal. My own brother had stolen my future and handed it over to a stranger, and he didn't even care. I called my mother immediately after Ryan hung up on me, my hand still trembling so badly that I nearly dropped the phone while dialing, my heart pounding with a mix of disbelief and fury that made it hard to think straight. I expected shock, confusion, maybe even anger on my behalf, because surely this had to be some misunderstanding that could be fixed once an adult stepped in and acknowledged how insane the situation was. The phone rang twice before she answered, and I barely managed to get out a few broken sentences about Ryan selling my house before she cut me off with a sharp intake of breath, not the kind that signals surprise, but the kind that signals irritation. Before I could even finish explaining, she said my name in that tone she used my entire childhood whenever I reacted in a way she found inconvenient. Before I could raise my voice or demand answers, she took control of the conversation completely. She told me to calm down. She told me not to be dramatic. And then she said something that made my blood run cold. She told me the house was always shared. She said it so casually, like she was correcting me about the weather or reminding me of an errand I'd forgotten. I felt like the ground had disappeared beneath me. I told her that wasn't true, that the house was in my name, that I paid for it myself, that I had the paperwork to prove it. She didn't even let me finish. She said families don't keep score like that. She said I had always been too obsessed with technicalities and legal nonsense. She said that when I moved to Japan, I basically abandoned the house and that Ryan had stepped up when I didn't. Then she dropped the part that made my stomach twist into a knot. She said they used the money from the sale to help Ryan start his new business. She said it like it was noble. Like it was obvious. Like it was something I should be proud of. I asked her how she could possibly think that was okay, how she could justify selling something that belonged to me without my consent, and she sighed heavily into the phone, clearly exhausted by what she considered my overreaction. She told me Ryan had always needed more help than I did. She reminded me that he struggled, that he had responsibilities, that starting over at his age wasn't easy. Then she said the words that finally snapped whatever fragile restraint I had left. She told me I was the youngest and that I'd bounce back. She said I was always resilient. She said I'd land on my feet like I always did. I stood there in the parking lot of a gas station, jet-lagged, homeless, and betrayed, listening to my own mother explain why stealing from me was acceptable because my brother needed it more. I asked her if she understood what she was saying, if she realized they had taken everything I had worked for over the last decade. She told me I was being selfish. She told me that money comes and goes but family is forever. She told me I should be grateful that my investment had helped keep the family afloat instead of sitting empty. My entire body was shaking by then, not just my hands, but my legs, my chest, my jaw clenched so tightly it hurt. I realized in that moment that she wasn't confused and she wasn't misinformed. She knew exactly what had happened. This wasn't Ryan acting alone. This was planned. Approved. Rationalized. They had discussed it, agreed on it, and moved forward without ever once thinking I deserved to be consulted. I wasn't a person in their eyes. I was a resource. I told her I was done talking. I told her that what they did was illegal. She laughed softly and said I was overestimating my position. She said dragging this through courts would only tear the family apart. She asked me if that's what I really wanted. That was the moment I understood something with terrifying clarity. She wasn't trying to fix anything. She was trying to scare me into silence. She was counting on guilt, on history, on the role I'd always played as the reasonable one, the flexible one, the one who gave in. I hung up without saying goodbye. I stood there staring at my phone, my reflection faintly visible on the dark screen, my face pale and unrecognizable. My hands were still shaking, but beneath the rage, something else was forming. Something cold and steady. This wasn't a misunderstanding. This wasn't a family conflict that could be smoothed over with apologies or time. This was deliberate. Calculated. They had decided that what was mine was theirs to take, and they expected me to accept it quietly. As I walked back to my car, I realized this wasn't just betrayal anymore. It was war. Growing up, it was always clear to me, even if no one ever said it out loud, that Ryan was the one the world was supposed to revolve around. He was the firstborn, the so-called visionary, the one everyone in the family described as gifted, ambitious, and full of potential, even when all the evidence pointed in the opposite direction. From as early as high school, he was already being treated like some misunderstood genius, too creative for traditional paths, too smart for the constraints of structure and rules. He bounced from one lofty idea to another, from a clothing brand he tried to launch in his early 20s, to a startup that was supposed to revolutionize social networking, to an app that never made it past beta testing. Every time he failed, there was always someone ready to excuse it. He was a risk-taker. He was learning. He was building something that people just didn't understand yet. What they didn't say out loud, but what I saw more and more clearly as I got older, was that every time Ryan made a mess, someone else in the family cleaned it up for him. My parents dipped into their retirement savings more than once to help him cover debts. He was bailed out of late rent, credit card debt, even a legal issue when one of his failed investors threatened to sue over misused funds. Every time, there was a new excuse, a new chapter in the never-ending story of why Ryan was still destined for greatness, why all of this was just part of his process. Meanwhile, I did everything the so-called right way. I worked 2 part-time jobs while studying full-time in college. I paid off my student loans without asking for a cent. I built a stable career, teaching abroad, saving diligently, and living modestly. I never missed a birthday or holiday call. I sent postcards from every new city. I never asked for help. And yet, in my parents' eyes, all of that was just expected. My independence wasn't seen as strength. It was seen as convenience, a reason to shift more of their energy and resources toward Ryan. They called it family balance. They said it was only fair that they helped him more because he struggled more. They told me he needed support, and that I didn't. They made it sound like a compliment, but it never felt like one. It felt like I was being punished for not being a burden. When I bought the house, I didn't do it to prove anything to them. I did it for me. It was my way of establishing roots, of creating a space that belonged entirely to me after years of living out of suitcases and furnished apartments. I worked hard for every cent I put into that property. No one helped. No one offered. And I didn't expect them to. But now, standing here years later, with my house sold out from under me and my savings effectively stolen, I realized that what I had taken as indifference from my family wasn't just emotional distance. It was entitlement. They believed that because I was the one who didn't ask, I was the one who could afford to give. And they had finally gone so far as to decide that what was mine could be reallocated without my consent, because Ryan needed it more. I couldn't stop thinking about how many times I had been told that Ryan just needed one more shot. One more chance. One more cash injection. That he was right on the edge of something big. That I should be proud to support him in the way family supports family. I had said no so many times before. I had made it clear I didn't want my hard work funneled into his fantasies. And still, they found a way to take it. They called it help. They called it unity. But I called it what it really was, theft. Carefully packaged, emotionally manipulated theft. And the worst part was, I knew they didn't think they did anything wrong. In their eyes, they were redistributing resources within the family. I was young. I'd bounce back, as my mother had so casually put it. Ryan was the one with the future. He just needed a bit of help getting there. But I had stopped believing in his potential a long time ago. Ryan wasn't a visionary. He was a parasite. And my parents, willingly or not, had enabled him at my expense. The next morning, after another sleepless night in a motel that smelled like bleach and stale air, I sat on the edge of the thin mattress with my laptop balanced on my knees, determined to find out exactly how the hell this had happened. I already knew from the bank and the county records that the house was no longer in my name, but the process, the actual mechanism that allowed a property I legally owned and had paid for in full to be transferred without my permission, still didn't make sense. Real estate transactions in Oregon, like most states, require signatures, notarized documents, filings. You can't just decide to sell someone else's house. Or at least that's what I thought. I pulled up the official property transfer records from the county assessor's website. The paperwork was there, plain as day. I stared at the scanned documents, the digital versions of the same papers I'd signed when I bought the house, only this time, they weren't mine. The new deed had my name removed and listed Ryan as the seller. Not me. Ryan, not a power of attorney representing me. Not a trustee. Just Ryan. And beside his name, there it was, a power of attorney document authorizing him to act on my behalf. The document looked official. It had a notary stamp, a signature that was supposed to be mine, and a date that made my stomach twist the moment I saw it. It was dated 3 years ago, almost to the hour, the exact day I left the country for Japan. The timing wasn't subtle. It was surgical. They had planned it to the minute, knowing I'd be thousands of miles away, unable to intervene, completely unaware of what was being done in my name. I zoomed in on the signature. At first glance, it looked close. My full legal name, slightly slanted, with the same looping E I'd used since college. But as I stared at it longer, the flaws began to jump out. The Y curved the wrong way. The pressure of the pen stroke was inconsistent, too light in places where I naturally pressed hard. It wasn't mine. It was close enough to fool a casual eye, or even an overworked clerk at the county office, but it wasn't mine. I checked the notary seal next. Oregon requires notaries to keep detailed logs of every transaction they witness, including IDs used and thumbprints for power of attorney documents. There was a name and license number on the scan, so I tracked down the notary through the state licensing board. After 2 calls and some uncomfortable questions, I finally got a receptionist to confirm that the notary listed had been under investigation for misconduct a few years back. She wouldn't give me details, but I didn't need them. I already knew what had happened. Someone had forged my signature. They had falsified a legal document and passed it through a notary willing to look the other way, or worse, someone who was in on it. And once that power of attorney was in Ryan's hands, he had everything he needed to take control of the house. He could access documents, request changes, even sign the sale agreement, all without me ever knowing. No phone call. No heads up. No chance to object. It was all done behind a smokescreen of forged legality, sealed with ink and rubber stamps and buried in county databases no one ever checks unless they have a reason to. I felt sick. Not just angry or betrayed, physically nauseated. This wasn't a clerical error or some legal loophole they stumbled into by accident. This was fraud. Real, premeditated fraud. And they had executed it with such confidence that I had never even suspected. They counted on my absence. They counted on my trust. They counted on the fact that I wouldn't go digging, that I'd just assume everything was in order. They didn't think I'd ever come back and check. But I had. And now I was staring at the evidence in high resolution on my screen, with my name twisted into a tool for my own financial destruction. I took screenshots of everything, every page, every signature, every seal, and saved them in multiple folders, backed them up to the cloud, to an external drive, even emailed them to myself under different aliases. My hands were cold. My vision was narrowing. But I kept going. I cross-referenced the timeline, comparing when the document was signed with my flight records, my emails from that week, even the timestamps on the photos I'd taken at the airport the day I left. There was no way I could have been present in Oregon on the day that signature was supposedly made. I had digital proof, concrete, time-stamped, GPS-tagged proof, that I was 5,000 miles away when someone sat down with a pen and decided they could become me for a day. And that's when the last piece clicked into place. This wasn't just a betrayal of trust or a family dispute that had gotten out of hand. This was criminal. And it wasn't just Ryan. Someone helped him. Someone notarized that document, someone filed it, someone processed the sale. My name had been hijacked and used like a skeleton key, and now the door had opened, my house, my savings, my security, was gone. I sat there in silence, staring at the screen, listening to the hum of the motel air conditioner and the occasional sound of trucks rumbling past on the highway. The walls of the room felt like they were closing in, but at the center of it all, a cold, quiet clarity settled over me. They thought I wouldn't notice. They thought I wouldn't fight. They thought, as always, that I'd bounce back. But this wasn't something I could bounce back from. This wasn't something I could forgive. This was the line. And they had crossed it. I chose the diner on purpose, a bland, overly lit place off the main road with cracked vinyl booths and a jukebox that hadn't worked since the 90s. It was neutral territory, public, loud enough to keep things from escalating but quiet enough that I could hear every word. I didn't give them much notice. I sent a single text in a group chat that hadn't been used in months: "We need to talk. 3 p.m. at Tanner's Diner. Everyone." No please. No explanation. Just a command. And to my surprise, they showed up, all of them. When I walked through the glass door, I spotted them immediately. Ryan was on the inside of the booth, his arms stretched out along the back like he was lounging in his own living room. Megan sat next to him, flipping through the dessert menu, her oversized sunglasses propped on her head like some suburban trophy wife cliché. My father sat across from them, his hands folded neatly on the table, expression unreadable. My mother was next to him, purse clutched in her lap, the corner of her mouth already twitching in that way it did whenever she braced for something emotional. None of them stood when I approached. Ryan gave a lazy smirk. Megan didn't look up. My parents offered a flat, synchronized nod, like I was an intern reporting for a performance review. I didn't sit. I didn't order coffee. I didn't ask how anyone was doing. I pulled the chair from the table just enough to lean on it and stared directly at Ryan. "Where's the money?" I asked, my voice low but sharp, the words cutting through the greasy clatter of plates and the distant hiss of the fryer in the kitchen. No one answered right away. Ryan blinked, exaggerated like he was trying to buy time or act confused. I didn't let the silence stretch. I repeated it. Louder. Firmer. "Where is the money, Ryan?" He leaned forward then, elbows on the table, fingers laced like he was about to pitch me a business idea. "It's not about the money, Em," he said. "You have to look at the bigger picture. We didn't steal anything. We liquidated assets to help you. You were out there wasting time in Japan, while things here were falling apart. We were saving the family." I laughed, a bitter, humorless sound that startled even myself. "Help me?" I asked. "You sold my house. You forged my signature. You stole everything I worked for." He shrugged. "You weren't using it." And then Megan, as if rehearsed, slid into the conversation with a voice so syrupy it made my skin crawl. "Emily, seriously. It was just sitting there. You were gone. You had your little adventure or whatever, and we were here, doing what had to be done. Don't be greedy." Greedy. That word hit me like a slap. I looked at her, her fresh manicure, her expensive handbag, the diamond-studded phone case she pulled out like it was a prop, and felt a rush of white-hot rage build in my chest. Greedy. For wanting the thing I had worked for. For being angry that my own family had dissected my life savings and passed the pieces around like birthday cake. My mother started to speak then, some carefully scripted line about family unity or how it was all very complicated, but I didn't let her finish. I reached into my bag, pulled out the folder I had printed at a copy center that morning, page after page of documentation, the property transfer, the sale agreement, the power of attorney with my forged signature, notarized and dated, with timelines and GPS metadata from my phone and flight records proving I wasn't even in the country when the documents were supposedly signed. I spread them out on the table slowly, one by one, like cards in a poker game. Ryan's smirk wavered. Megan stopped chewing her gum. My mother's eyes darted to my father, who still hadn't spoken a word. "This," I said, tapping the forged signature with my finger, "is fraud. This is a felony. This is prison time. And every single one of you is complicit." No one said anything. Ryan looked at the papers like he wasn't sure whether to deny or downplay them. Megan glanced toward the windows, like she was checking for an exit. My father finally spoke, barely above a whisper. "Let's not do this here." But it was already done. I took out my phone and snapped several photos of the documents on the table with them in the background. No one moved. No one dared try to stop me. I wasn't shouting. I wasn't crying. I wasn't making a scene. I was documenting, with precision, with intent, and with every ounce of control I had left. Then I picked up the papers, slid them neatly back into the folder, and stood up. No goodbye. No threats. No explanations. Just a long, hard look at the 4 people who had once been my family, now sitting in silence at a diner booth, exposed. And I walked out. By the time I walked into Sarah Moreno's office, I was running on caffeine, adrenaline, and a simmering rage that hadn't left me since the confrontation at the diner. Her firm was located in a modest but sharp-looking brick building downtown, the kind of place that didn't try to impress with glitz because it didn't need to. I'd found her through a recommendation from an old college friend who worked in corporate law and told me, if someone screwed you over in real estate and you want justice, Moreno doesn't just play hardball, she throws it. I didn't care about pleasantries. I needed someone who didn't flinch when things got ugly. And from the second Sarah looked at the stack of paperwork I dropped onto her desk, I knew I had come to the right person. She was in her late 40s, sharp-featured, wearing a navy blue pantsuit and no jewelry aside from a slim wedding band. Her desk was meticulously organized, but not sterile, files stacked in clean rows, a legal pad with bullet points, a single cup of coffee growing cold beside a half-read deposition. She didn't offer me water or make small talk. She opened the folder and started reading. I sat silently, my heart pounding harder with each second she spent flipping through the forged documents. When she got to the power of attorney page, she stopped. Looked at it closely. Then looked at me. This is not civil, she said flatly, without even raising her voice. This is criminal. This is forgery, fraud, and identity theft, across state lines, which could bring federal charges if we push hard enough. She pulled the document closer and tapped her pen on the notary stamp. Look at this, she said. This stamp? It's expired. It was already invalid at the time this document was supposedly signed. That alone is enough to cast doubt on the entire transaction. But the signature, that's the core. If you weren't here to sign this, and they knew you weren't, they manufactured your consent. That's identity theft. It's premeditated. They used it to transfer ownership of a property worth over $500,000. That makes it grand theft by fraud. I didn't speak. I just nodded, my throat tight, relief and validation washing over me so fast it almost made me dizzy. For weeks, I'd been gaslit, told I was being dramatic, that I didn't understand the situation, that I was greedy, that I abandoned my family and should be grateful they did anything at all with the property. But here, in this office, with this woman who had no reason to lie to me or sugarcoat the situation, I was finally hearing the truth. And the truth was worse than I'd let myself believe, but also more powerful. Sarah flipped through the rest of the documents, the deed transfer, the forged authorization, the sale agreement, the property tax records, and made annotations on her legal pad as she went. Every few minutes she'd mutter something under her breath. Incompetent title company. They're gonna regret touching this. No due diligence, sloppy all around. Then she sat back, looked me dead in the eye, and said, "We're going after all of them." It wasn't a question. It was a promise. She laid out a plan without hesitation. First, we would file a formal criminal complaint with the state's Department of Justice, attaching the forged documents, the evidence of my whereabouts on the date of the supposed signing, and the expired notary credentials. Then she would contact the title company involved in the sale, not to ask questions, but to put them on notice. If they'd failed to verify the authenticity of the power of attorney, or worse, had ignored red flags, they were liable too. Meanwhile, she would begin drafting a civil suit naming Ryan, my parents, Megan, and anyone else involved in the chain of fraud. She wanted a full forensic financial investigation, to trace the proceeds of the sale, identify the accounts where the money was deposited, and determine exactly who benefited. She told me we could petition to freeze any assets linked to the transaction once we had probable cause. If he used the money to start that business you mentioned, she said, we may be able to seize the accounts or recover profits. If he funneled it into joint accounts with his wife, we name her too. No one gets to play innocent here. I asked her how long this process would take. She said it depended. If we kept it quiet, it could be months. But if we went in publicly, with a criminal complaint and aggressive civil action, it could explode fast. She looked me over again, as if sizing me up. You want to crush them, she said, not just get the house back, right? I nodded. And she smiled for the first time. Good, she said. Because that's what we're going to do. She walked me through the next steps with precision: notarized affidavits, sworn statements, copies of my travel records, correspondence with Ryan and my parents, even the photo I took at the diner with the forged documents laid out in front of them. She wanted it all. Everything they thought I wouldn't keep. Everything they assumed I'd be too heartbroken or too ashamed to document. She said this wasn't just a real estate case. This was a full-blown fraud scheme, and we had more than enough to pursue it from every angle: civil restitution, criminal prosecution, and reputational exposure. As I left her office, documents in hand, my head was still spinning, but for the first time since I'd returned home and found a stranger living in what should have been my house, I felt something other than grief or betrayal. I felt fire. I felt direction. I felt power. And with Sarah Moreno on my side, I knew they were about to feel it too. Just days before we were ready to file, when Sarah had finished assembling the complaint packet and was finalizing the submission to the state's Department of Justice, everything took a turn, not legally, but socially. That's when Megan, in an act so calculated and venomous it almost impressed me, went public. She posted a long, emotionally manipulative rant on Facebook, Instagram, and even a neighborhood community forum that had over 1,000 local members. It was full of half-truths, blatant lies, and twisted fragments of the story designed to make me look like a monster. She didn't mention the forged documents. She didn't mention the fact that the house wasn't hers, that my signature had been faked, that Ryan had committed a felony. She didn't mention the theft. Instead, she painted a picture of a cold, distant sister-in-law who had spent years traveling the world while her struggling family tried to keep things afloat. According to her version, I had abandoned the home, refused to communicate, and promised not to return. She made it sound like I'd gifted the house and was now cruelly reneging on that unspoken generosity. But the part that made my blood run cold, the line that became the centerpiece of her performance, was when she wrote, "Now, after years of silence, Emily has come back just to throw a pregnant woman into the street. No warning. No compassion. Just cruelty." She knew exactly what she was doing. That one sentence turned everything upside down. Comments poured in by the hundreds. People who didn't know me, who had never spoken to me, never asked for context, started parroting her language. Calling me heartless. Saying I should be ashamed. Neighbors I hadn't even met yet posted vague statuses about how money makes people forget blood. Some were more direct, tagging Megan and offering support, writing things like "Stay strong, mama. Your family will get through this." Others started sending me private messages, some angry, some just curious, all of them buying into her version of the story. Within 2 days, it wasn't just internet noise. It was real. I noticed it first at the grocery store when an older woman I didn't recognize narrowed her eyes at me in the produce section, then turned her cart around with deliberate drama. Later, I passed by a neighbor's driveway, someone I used to know in high school, and saw them glance up from raking leaves, only to immediately look away and whisper something to their spouse. People who once would have waved or nodded now pretended not to see me or greeted me with tight, forced smiles. I even got an email from a distant cousin in Idaho, who hadn't spoken to me in 5 years, accusing me of airing family laundry in court and saying I should remember where I came from. It was surreal. Megan had lit a match and tossed it into dry grass, and now the fire was spreading everywhere. She framed it as a plea for empathy, but it was an attack, plain and simple, one designed to isolate me, pressure me into silence, maybe even scare me into backing off. I could see the intent behind every word. She wanted to poison the well before the legal battle even began. She wanted me to feel alone. She wanted to make sure that when the subpoenas started landing and the lawsuits went public, I'd already be the villain in everyone's mind. But I didn't take the bait. I didn't respond. I didn't post a rebuttal, didn't write a counter-narrative, didn't send mass messages trying to explain the truth. Sarah had warned me this could happen, that when people like Megan lose control of the facts, they try to control the story instead. She reminded me that internet sympathy is easy to buy with the right lie, and public perception can be as fickle as weather. What mattered was evidence. Documentation. The law. Still, it hurt more than I expected. Not the strangers, I could live with their judgment. What stung was the quiet complicity of people who should have known better. Former teachers, family friends, distant relatives who had once praised my independence, now nodding along with Megan's version like it made more sense than the reality I was living. They didn't see the years I'd spent scraping together every dime to buy that house. They didn't know the endless shifts, the side gigs, the days I'd gone without so I could make extra payments. They didn't care that I hadn't abandoned anything, that I had set up automatic maintenance, paid taxes, kept the house secure and legally intact, until it was taken from me with forged paperwork. All they saw was the viral version. The dramatic headline. The teary woman in her second trimester telling the world that I had no heart. They didn't care about the details. They wanted a story. So I stayed quiet. I stayed focused. I didn't respond to the posts. I didn't argue with comments. I didn't text Megan or Ryan or my parents to demand they correct the narrative. I let them have their little moment of self-righteous attention, their pity likes and comment section applause. Because while they were busy campaigning for sympathy online, I was preparing a legal case that would drag everything, the lies, the fraud, the signatures, the stolen money, into a courtroom where likes and hashtags didn't mean a damn thing. The truth was coming. And when it did, it would be carved into the public record forever, not as a sob story, but as a chain of criminal acts. No amount of curated Instagram posts would protect them from that. It happened late in the afternoon, just as the sun had started to dip low behind the tree line and cast long shadows across the front yard of the rental where I was staying. I wasn't expecting visitors, especially not from anyone in my family, so when I heard the knock at the door, 3 slow, deliberate raps, my stomach tightened. I looked through the peephole, and there he was. My father. Standing on the porch like it was just another Sunday afternoon, like he hadn't sat silently across from me in that diner while my life was being dissected and rationalized away. For a moment, I considered not answering. I hovered near the door, completely still, hoping maybe he'd walk away. But something in me, maybe curiosity, maybe the urge to look into the face of someone who had helped destroy my trust, made me open it. I didn't greet him. I just held the door half open, hand braced against the frame. He looked tired. Older than I remembered. He didn't smile. I just want to talk, he said. I didn't invite him in. I stepped outside and closed the door behind me, keeping the screen between us and the rest of my life. I didn't say much. Just waited. He started slowly, like he was testing the waters. He said the family was worried about me. That I was making a mistake by escalating things. That court would only make things uglier than they needed to be. Then he said something that told me this wasn't a peace offering, this was damage control. He said, we can make this go away quietly. Just drop the legal stuff. No one has to be dragged through the mud. I didn't respond. I just slipped my phone from my pocket, opened the recording app, and tapped the red button without breaking eye contact. What followed was a cascade of excuses dressed up as concern. He said they didn't understand how serious it had gotten. That Megan was emotional and Ryan was under pressure and that it all got out of hand. He said I'd always been the strong one, the logical one, the one who could look past mistakes. And then, whether because he was too comfortable or because he actually believed what he was saying wouldn't incriminate him, he let it slip. We knew Ryan was practicing your signature, he said, his voice low and almost conspiratorial, like he was telling me a family secret instead of admitting to a felony. But we thought it was just to help speed things up. You know, get things processed while you were away. We didn't think it'd go this far. I kept my face neutral. Numb, almost. But inside, everything stopped. I didn't blink. I didn't breathe. I just let him keep talking, because now I had exactly what I needed. He had no idea I was recording. He probably thought he was doing the right thing, making peace, smoothing things over. But what he was actually doing was confessing, in his own words, that they had known. That the forgery wasn't some rogue act by Ryan. It had been discussed. Observed. Aloud. And my father, the one person in that family I'd held out hope might have been deceived like me, had watched it happen. And said nothing. After a few more minutes of platitudes and quiet pleading, he finally stopped, waiting for me to say something. I didn't. I just nodded once, small and tight. Then I turned and walked back inside without another word, closing the door behind me with a calmness I didn't feel. Inside, I sank into the nearest chair, heart racing, hands clammy. I played the audio back 3 times, making sure it was clear, audible, unambiguous. It was all there, the knowledge, the admission, the pathetic justification. That night, I sent the file to Sarah. I didn't add context. I didn't need to. The next morning, I walked into her office, and before I could even sit down, she hit play on her laptop. We both listened again, this time in silence, her eyes narrowing as my father's voice spilled out into the room like poison. When it ended, she leaned forward so fast that her chair actually squeaked. "That's it," she said. "That's the nail." She explained that this recording wasn't just damning, it was powerful. It directly tied my family to premeditated fraud. It showed that the forgery had been anticipated and accepted. That they weren't victims of misunderstanding or swept up in someone else's bad decision, they were active participants. She told me we could now prove intent. That their defense, whatever it might be, had just crumbled. That line about practicing your signature was everything. It was conspiracy. It was knowledge. And it destroyed any plausible deniability. She started making calls within minutes. Reaching out to contacts. Planning the next filing. She said we'd fast-track the criminal referral and fold this into the civil case. She wanted to subpoena my father. She wanted to put him under oath. And with this recording, even the best attorney in the state wouldn't be able to spin it. I left her office that day with the first real taste of justice sitting on my tongue, bitter, cold, but deeply satisfying. They had treated me like an obstacle. A problem. An afterthought. But now I was holding the truth in my pocket. And I wasn't letting it go. 2 days after I gave Sarah the recording of my father admitting that Ryan had been practicing my signature, everything began moving faster than I could have anticipated. Sarah didn't waste a second. She immediately filed an emergency motion to freeze any and all assets linked to the fraudulent sale of the property, attaching every piece of evidence we had, the forged power of attorney, the expired notary stamp, the digital proof of my physical absence from the country on the date of signing, and now the recorded confession from my father, which clearly established foreknowledge and intent. The court approved the motion in less than 48 hours. Just like that, $620,000 was locked down. Every account Ryan had touched in the last year, his business checking account, a personal savings account under both his and Megan's names, even a separate brokerage account Sarah's team had traced through a last-minute wire transfer, was frozen. The financial institutions were ordered to suspend all withdrawals, transfers, or access until the matter could be resolved in court. When Sarah called to tell me the motion had gone through, her tone was calm but charged. "It's done," she said. "The money's not going anywhere. They can't hide it, spend it, or move it offshore. That house, and everything tied to it, is now radioactive." I sat on the edge of the hotel bed, staring at the floor, processing the magnitude of what she'd just said. In less than a week, Sarah had taken a wrecking ball to everything they'd tried to build on the back of that theft. It was the first real blow they couldn't spin, couldn't downplay, couldn't publicly reframe with some sob story on social media. And then, as if that weren't enough, the real bombshell dropped. Sarah called me again the following morning, her voice sharp with barely contained energy. "You're going to want to sit down," she said. I already was. The notary confessed. I didn't speak. I just waited. According to Sarah, her team had tracked down the notary listed on the fraudulent power of attorney, a woman named Darlene Shaw, who had lost her license shortly after the document was filed due to irregularities in several unrelated transactions. After being contacted by one of Sarah's private investigators, and learning that formal charges might soon follow, Darlene cracked. She confessed to everything. Megan had approached her personally, not through an office, but at her home, late in the evening, under the pretense of needing a quick signature for a family emergency. Megan claimed her sister-in-law was out of the country, unreachable, and that this was just a routine authorization to handle a property issue. Darlene said she hesitated at first, but then Megan pulled out an envelope filled with cash, $5,000 in $100 bills, and offered it on the spot. No ID was shown. No signature was witnessed. No phone call was made to verify consent. Darlene had simply stamped the document, signed it, and walked away, thinking she could get away with it, or at least that it would never come back to her. Now it had. The notary's confession was notarized itself, this time, properly, and delivered directly to Sarah's office. It was a written admission of professional misconduct, including dates, times, the amount of money exchanged, and a full description of Megan. With that statement, the entire fraudulent framework collapsed. The forgery was no longer just something we suspected, it was proven. The person who had legalized the document had now testified to its illegitimacy. And with the money frozen and the confession on record, we were in complete control. Sarah's legal team immediately filed to amend our complaint, adding Megan as a direct co-conspirator to the fraud, not just a beneficiary. They filed a referral to the state attorney general's office and prepared subpoenas for Megan, Ryan, and Darlene. We were no longer just pursuing civil restitution. Now we had the foundation for a criminal case. And just like that, the scam began to unravel. All the lies, the manipulation, the social media smear campaign, the sanctimonious posts about family and abandonment, were now exposed for what they really were: distractions. Misdirection. Desperate, self-serving theater meant to cover up a felony. They hadn't just sold my house behind my back. They had orchestrated a multi-step, coordinated scheme involving falsified documents, bribery, and impersonation, all for money they never had a right to in the first place. In the span of a week, everything they had touched, the business Ryan started with the proceeds, the social currency Megan tried to build online, the pathetic moral high ground they stood on, had turned to dust. No one could deny what had happened anymore. No narrative could save them. The truth wasn't just coming. It had arrived. The courtroom was cold, not just from the air conditioning that hummed steadily from vents above, but from the sterile, clinical atmosphere that made it feel more like a surgical theater than a place of justice. It was packed that morning, not with spectators, but with lawyers, clerks, and a small, tense cluster of people who had once called themselves my family. I sat on one side with Sarah beside me, her suit crisp, her expression locked in that sharp, predatory calm she wore whenever she was about to deliver something lethal. Across from us, Ryan, my parents, and Megan sat huddled together with two attorneys who looked as though they'd just realized they were standing on a sinking ship. The proceedings moved faster than I expected, probably because there was nothing left to argue. Everything had already been submitted in the weeks leading up to the hearing: the evidence, the sworn affidavits, the financial records, the travel logs from my airline and passport stamps showing I was out of the country on the exact day my signature was supposedly witnessed by a notary who had since confessed to taking a cash bribe from Megan. The forged power of attorney was enlarged and displayed on a monitor in front of the judge, my name scrawled across the bottom in a handwriting that, to anyone who had ever seen my actual signature, was almost laughably off. Sarah stood when it was time, her voice clear and cutting as she outlined the timeline. She walked the court through every step of the fraud: how I had legally purchased the house, how payments had been automated while I was abroad, how Ryan had acquired and used a forged document to illegally transfer and sell the property, how Megan had bribed a notary to skip protocol, and how the proceeds were funneled directly into accounts now frozen by court order. When she finished, she handed the judge a packet containing the notary's full confession, notarized this time with proper oversight and corroborated by a signed receipt for the $5,000 Megan had paid in cash. Then came the part one hadn't prepared myself for: the judge's response. He didn't shout. He didn't dramatize anything for effect. But as he flipped through the evidence, his brow creased deeper with every page, his silence heavy and deliberate. Finally, he set the packet down and looked over at Ryan with the kind of expression that made the air in the room go still. He said the fraud was clear. That the forgery was not just crude but premeditated. He noted the sequence of events, the precision with which the theft had been timed to coincide with my departure from the country, and said plainly that the defendants had coordinated to deceive, misappropriate funds, and exploit both family trust and legal systems for personal gain. Then he ordered Ryan to stand. What followed was a brief but blistering statement from the judge. He cited Oregon state statutes on felony fraud, identity theft, and forgery, and ruled that there was sufficient evidence not only to proceed with full civil penalties but to support criminal prosecution. On the spot, he issued an arrest warrant. Two deputies who had been stationed near the door stepped forward. I watched, frozen in a surreal kind of silence, as my brother, who had smirked through our first confrontation, who had mocked me behind my back and convinced himself he was too clever to get caught, was handcuffed and removed from the courtroom in front of everyone. He didn't look at me. Not once. The judge turned to my parents next. His tone shifted, not softer, but more direct. He said they had enabled the fraud by either participating or deliberately turning a blind eye. He cited my father's recorded admission, where he acknowledged knowing Ryan was forging my signature, and said that silence in the face of known illegal activity constituted complicity. He ruled that they were financially liable for the full restitution of the $620,000, plus all legal fees I had incurred, including investigative expenses, court costs, and attorney hours billed over the previous several months. He gave them 60 days to begin payments or risk liens on their property and garnishment of any retirement funds. My mother didn't say a word, just looked down at her lap, her hands clenched tightly together like she was trying to keep from unraveling in front of strangers. My father stared ahead, lips pressed in a thin, defeated line. Then, predictably, Megan tried to cry. She stood up, or rather, she half rose from her seat, and began speaking in a breathless, rehearsed tone, claiming she didn't understand what she was signing, that she was just trying to protect her unborn child, that she was pressured, that she had only done what Ryan told her. But Sarah cut her off with a single objection, stating clearly that Megan had paid a notary under the table and had directed the bribe herself. The judge waved Megan down with a firm hand, clearly unmoved by the performance. He ruled that Megan was to be included as a co-conspirator in the civil judgment. Her attempt to distance herself had not only failed, it had backfired. Her name would remain on every document, every filing, every future motion. She would carry the burden of this case for the rest of her financial life, whether she stayed married to Ryan or not. I didn't smile. I didn't cry. I just sat there, perfectly still, as the courtroom slowly emptied out, leaving only the echo of the judge's words in my ears and the quiet, steady hum of justice finally being done. The scam wasn't just exposed. It had been dismantled. Publicly, permanently, and under oath. And they would never recover from it. Getting the house back wasn't the moment of triumph I had always imagined it would be. Legally, yes, it was returned to me, full title reinstated, all fraudulent documents voided, ownership recorded properly in my name once again. The money was restored as well, every cent of it pulled from frozen accounts and rerouted back to me after months of litigation, investigations, and sworn testimony. On paper, it was a complete victory. But when I pulled into that driveway for the first time after everything had unraveled, after the arrests, the judgments, the betrayals, all I felt was hollow. The house was exactly as I remembered it and also completely foreign. The porch had been repainted, the shutters changed, the landscaping reshaped into something that looked polished but artificial. Megan's touches, I assumed. The scent of lavender and bleach hit me the second I opened the front door, and the silence inside was not peaceful, it was suffocating. Every corner held a memory I hadn't made. Every room had been tainted by people who had no right to be there. I walked through it slowly, one hand trailing along the walls I had once dreamed of decorating, floors I had once imagined pacing barefoot with coffee in hand. But none of it felt like mine anymore. They had taken more than money. More than the deed. They had stolen the sense of belonging I had poured into that place, scraped away the security and pride I had built over years of sacrifice. And even though I had won, legally and undeniably, I realized I could never live in that house again. The damage wasn't just structural. It was emotional, visceral, permanent. I couldn't sleep in the bedroom where Megan and Ryan had probably laughed about me. I couldn't eat in the kitchen where they planned the lies. I couldn't take a bath in that tub without imagining the silence they'd filled with their entitlement. It wasn't my home anymore. It was a crime scene. So I sold it. Within a week, I signed it away to a new family, a kind couple with 2 kids and no connection to my past. I didn't even haggle. I just wanted it gone. I wanted the smell of that betrayal out of my lungs. The sale went through smoothly, and when the wire hit my account, I didn't even look at the number. I just closed the laptop and exhaled for what felt like the first time in years. I didn't go back to Oregon after that. I didn't visit my parents. I didn't respond to the half-hearted emails from relatives trying to mend fences after staying silent during the worst of it. I cut the whole network loose. I bought 10 acres of land in Montana, near a lake so still it looked like glass at sunrise. There were no neighbors within view. No one dropping by. No uninvited voices, no gossip, no guilt-tripping phone calls. I hired a local builder to construct a small, single-level cabin, clean lines, open space, floor-to-ceiling windows looking out at the water. I chose every board, every finish, every stone in the fireplace myself. And when it was done, I moved in with nothing but what I wanted to bring. The quiet here isn't empty. It's grounding. I wake up to birds instead of text alerts. I fall asleep to wind moving through pine trees instead of the buzz of family dysfunction. I spend my days reading, working remotely, walking the property line with a dog I rescued from a shelter, building a life that no one else gets to touch. There are no shared walls. No expectations. No performative conversations. Just the steady rhythm of a life I chose, one that can't be tampered with, rewritten, or signed away. They can't reach me here. Not legally. Not emotionally. Not in whispers or passive-aggressive messages filtered through cousins or community gossip. The house they stole, and the fantasy they built on my back, is gone. Burned down by truth, buried in court records, and turned into a cautionary tale with my name cleared and theirs forever stained. Peace isn't loud. It doesn't arrive with fanfare. It doesn't need validation. It's a quiet cabin by a still lake, built on land I bought with money I earned and reclaimed. It's the space between their lies and my silence, filled only with the things I allow in. And that peace, bought with pain, paid in full, is power they will never be able to take from me again.